Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. Each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
Here on the program, we like to certainly spend some time talking about how to equip you to be able to articulate a biblical worldview, and also to know how to defend a biblical worldview, which is oftentimes called apologetics. So we're going to focus some time and attention on that particular issue today, because we recognize that one of the fastest growing demographic groups in America are the unaffiliated, those who have sort of an unbelief. Sometimes they're referred to as the nones, those that describe themselves as atheist, agnostic, or no preference. Now, some of those individuals, maybe they've read a book by one of the so-called new atheists, whether it's Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Daniel Dennett, or when he was alive, Christopher Hitchens. But a larger percentage of them just really never thought about the issue in any significant way, and don't see that religion or Christianity is relevant. So we really want to try to equip you today as we talk about a book that is coming out shortly called Atheism on Trial: A Lawyer Examines the Case for Unbelief. It is written by Mark Lanier, and if that name sounds familiar, you can go back to an interview that we did with him many years ago. Christianity on Trial was that book, and it's still available on our website. Just go to, maybe type in his name, or go to December 11th, 2014, because that was a great interview that we had with him. Individual that has his law degree from Texas Tech University, is the founder of the Lanier Law Firm, as well as, I think many of you remember that he also has been an individual involved in pulling together just an incredible library. And so sometimes we've been talking with Jeremiah Johnston, or we've talked with a variety of other individuals. They've used that facility. He actually teaches at Bible literacy and a Sunday school class at Camp Champion Forest Baptist Church. That's where our good friend Jarrett Stevens is now the pastor, and also was the founder of the Christian Trial Lawyers Association. So, Mark Lanier, welcome back to Point of View.
Kirby, love to be on your show. Heavens, I love to listen to your show. So thank you for having me.
Well, we're going to convene a courtroom, and before we get into your opening statements and then some of the other issues, you do point out the fact that you do live in a world in which, in the world of law, you look at evidence, you look at facts, you look at logic, you use all sorts of different things to make judgments, but you also are in the world of faith. But you point out the fact that you, even though you have feet in both worlds, oftentimes when you meet your fellow lawyers, they fail to apply some of the principles of logic and evidence that they use in a courtroom into religious faith. And in some respects, I think that's why you wrote the book.
Oh, absolutely, Kirby. It amazes me how people can say, oh, I believe in proof. I believe in the importance of justice. I believe in the importance of evidence. And yet on the fundamental aspects of their life, they just fritter away and live a humdrum existence, not asking themselves the hard questions, not examining the evidence for the truth that is there. And that's what I seek to do in this book, and seek to do with people when I engage them on this subject.
And again, this is published by InterVarsity Press. We have information about, of course, Mark Lanier. We have information about this book, and you can pre-order it. It'll be out shortly. Okay, Counselor, let's convene the court. Your opening statement, and you spent some time talking about this idea of worldview buckets. Can you explain?
Yeah. To me, Kirby, there are different ways you can look at the world, your explanations of life. And one is biblical Christianity. And that's my worldview. That's the way I see the world. It's one that I didn't just stumble into. It's not just one I inherited. It is the result of my lifetime of probing and trying to answer these questions. And that's the one you were gracious enough to interview me on in 2014 with Christianity on Trial, where I put that on trial. The second bucket is the bucket that I consider to be unbelief. And these are the people who say, I just really don't see any reason to believe there's a God. I don't see evidence. I don't see proof. And my life is going along fine without it. And that bucket's comprised of two different groups in a sense. That group, which is adamantly there is no God, and this would include the prominent new atheists you were mentioning, Dawkins, Harris, Bennett, and those guys, and even a level beyond them, there are not so popular atheists who write on that issue. You've got them, but then you've got this huge element in that second bucket of just people who say, I don't think there's a God. I just don't see the proof of it, but I'm not too hung up on it, and I don't really need to fuss or think about it too hard.
Well, again, I've run into many more of those individuals. We just a year ago had a survey of more than 3,000 individuals, and we found that when you would actually probe those questions and ask, you found that it wasn't so much that there were a lot of people shaking their fist and having just read one of the new atheists. There's just a lot of people saying, as you said, I just sort of feel pretty good about myself, and so I guess I'm sort of a pragmatic atheist or agnostic. And so in some respects, that brings me to the second argument that you deal with, and that is burden of proof. Now, I do not go into a courtroom, but I do debates. And when I've done debates, sometimes you ask yourself the question before you go into that debate, or before I maybe moderate a debate, who bears the burden of proof? And you think that that's another very important issue in this discussion, isn't it?
That's a huge issue, and I'll toot your family horn for a moment. You've got a son-in-law, Luke Lafitte, who does what I do as well. In fact, we went to the same law school, though I beat him out of there about 20 years earlier. But he and I, every day, and other people who do the same work we do, we go into a courtroom and we have a burden to prove something to be true. And so what I did in this book is I suggested two things. I suggested that those people who are the evangelistic atheists, for lack of a better word, those people who are the Sam Harris who write these books, there are Dawkins who writes The God Delusion and tries to argue that they will prove there is no God. Ultimately, they have no such proof. What they ultimately do is say, prove to me there is a God. And we will assume there's not until you prove it. And then what they do is they play another mind trick with you. They ask you to prove it using science.
Yes.
And that's a mind trick, Kirby, because science is really good at proving scientific truth if you're using the right test. So on a simple basis, I can use a thermometer to tell me what the temperature is. But that thermometer will be of no use to me if I'm trying to gauge how far I am from my car. Now, both of those are questions that need to be tested or measured or proven, but I need a yardstick or a tape measure or a laser measurer to determine distance and a thermometer to determine temperature. Well, if we're going to try and prove the existence of God, we're not going to prove the existence of God with math room logic in the sense of taking a chalkboard and proving 2 + 2 = 4. Yes. Therefore 4 - 2 = 2. Well, that's wonderful for math, but God's not a mathematic problem. This is more akin to what we do in a courtroom. So, for example, one of the cases that we got a lot of notoriety on.
Let me jump in real quickly. We'll talk about that after this break because I think it's an important example of evidence. We'll talk about that right after these important messages.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Americans are being watched digitally, and it doesn't seem to matter whether they're innocent citizens, suspects, or criminals. That is the argument made in the brief filed by the Rutherford Institute in a case before the Supreme Court. The case involves a man who federal investigators traced using cell site location information that allowed them to trace his movements back in time. He was arrested, indicted, and convicted. The issue isn't his guilt, but the fact that the information was gathered electronically without a warrant. The use of this technology provided a conviction, but it can also be used to identify where you are at a given time. It can tell if you're at home, in church, at a store, or on a political event. The typical response for many people is they have nothing to hide. But consider how this technology is currently being used in communist China. John Whitehead is the president of the Rutherford Institute and observes that cell phones have become de facto snitches, offering up a steady stream of digital location on users' movements and travels. Then also consider the fact that the police are tracking people's movements by way of license plate toll readers, scouring social media posts, triangulating data from cell phone towers and Wi-Fi signals, layering facial recognition software on top of that, and then cross-referencing footage from public social media posts. Essentially, Americans are being swept up in a massive digital data dragnet that does not distinguish between those who are innocent of wrongdoing, suspects, and criminals. We are supposedly protected by the Fourth Amendment, but this new technology allows investigators access to our lives and activities. We are not only losing our privacy, but technology is being used against us even when we are innocent of wrongdoing. That is why I'm glad this case is before the Supreme Court. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue conversation today with Mark Lanier. His book coming out is Atheism on Trial. A Lawyer Examines the Case for Unbelief. Let me also encourage you to find out more about him and the Lanier Theological Library, which we've mentioned many times when Peter Williams and others have been in town and talked about various lectures that they will be giving there. So I would encourage you to check that out. But Mark, again, a good example of that. I can use a thermometer right now to measure the temperature in this room, but I can't use it to measure the liquid in this cup or the distance of this microphone from our camera. And so you certainly make that point, but you also use an example from one of your court cases to, again, show some of the logic that we need to have.
Yeah, Kirby, so one of the cases that got a lot of press attention was a case we represented 22 women. I tried the case on behalf of these ladies who had ovarian cancer that the jury found, I think properly, had been caused by the asbestos present in baby powder. And the company, I should add, has pulled the baby powder from the shelves that had the talc asbestos in it since our case and is no longer there. But in that case, one of the things I had to prove to the jury was that the level of suffering and the level of mental anguish that these ladies experienced and the love that they had for their families. Now, if you think about it, there is no way to prove that with a chemistry test. There's no way to prove that with scientific examination that you mark out on a theorem on a chalkboard. There's no way to, but does that mean we can't prove it? Well, of course we can prove it. It's required that we prove it under law, but proof means you put all of the evidence out there, you put it in scales, and you ask yourself, what is more likely than not? what is the greater weight of credible evidence. Now, our court system is supposedly, and I believe, the best arbiter of truth that mankind has ever come up with. It is the fruit of culture and civilization that goes back to the very beginning. And it is the pinnacle of how we figured out to do, based on that, the jury could assess billions of dollars against the company I was trying the case against, and it would be upheld all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. Based on that, we take children and decide which parent could better parent the children in a horrible divorce situation. Based on that, we put people to death and use the death penalty because we're convinced that our system will derive truth. Well, our system says on important issues like this, of truth, of non-science, that's the best way to determine it. You put all of the evidence in the scales and you ask yourself, what is more likely than not? And that is the burden of proof that we use in a courtroom. And so that's what I tried to do with belief and unbelief. Just put all of the evidence in the scales and ask yourself what makes most sense.
As a matter of fact, I might just say right now, get in your mind's eye one of those so-called scales of justice. You've seen them before. And on one side, the scale will say the evidence for God. On the other side, it will be the evidence for no God. And we're going to spend some time looking at such issues as beauty, objective right and wrong, human dignity, many of which I would say, Mark, we covered when we talked about your earlier book, Christianity on Trial. But you take us back to trying to look at these issues, and before we get into those, you have some chapters that deal with some of the atheist arguments and the whole issue of agnosticism. To put those chapters in some kind of context, you find that some of the more compelling arguments for unbelief really aren't logical arguments. They're not based on evidence. They're really based more on emotion, aren't they?
I think that's really true. And it's true not just in the sense that I've tried to write it up that way, but I write it up that way because it's the truth of my experience. I talk to atheists and agnostics all the time. It's a constant drumbeat. One of the benefits of getting Trial Lawyer of the Year and all of these awards and accolades is I get invited to a lot of these dinners, and then I get invited to teach at the law schools, the leading schools, Harvard, Texas Tech, Stanford, Chicago, all of those notable leading schools. And when I speak at the law schools, or whenever I speak at these seminars, I'm always engaging people on matters of faith and belief as well, because it's so critically important that people hear someone with some level of integrity in their field address these types of issues. And so I find most people who don't believe in God almost either are avoiding asking the real questions, or they've got this emotional argument where they feel like God let them down sometime, or if there's a God, then why is there suffering in the world? Now, I was teaching a class at Wheaton College one time. There was a class that used to be offered there, it may still be, I don't know, on how to share your faith. And there were 42 students in that class, and I asked them with total anonymity, knowing I was only in there to teach for a day. I didn't know who they were. I couldn't recognize their handwriting, and I would destroy all of the evidence in front of them as soon as they did it. Would they each write down their personal biggest challenge to faith? In other words, what is it? Not how to share their faith with others, but what are the struggles they have internally? And one of them wrote, why, if there is a God, would that God allow a dope addict, unemployed prostitute to get pregnant and bring a child into this world? And I said, this is an emotional question. This is more than it is an intellectual question, but it's got an intellectual base, and let's deal with it. I said, the answer is quite simple. God set up a world where women during a fertile time produce eggs, and men during fertility years are able to produce sperm. And if the sperm meets the egg in the right time in the right place, voila, you've got total DNA that will reproduce and bring forth a child. I said, now that's the way God made the world. God never said this is a Harry Potter world where the laws of nature and the world are suspended automatically, and God acts as the cosmic birth control. It's the same idea of, if there's a God, why would God allow a 2-year-old to get hit by a car? Well, God's not the one who drove the car. God's not the one who let the kid play in the street. But we have this idea that if there's a God, he should be the cosmic babysitter, or maybe the cosmic breathalyzer that keeps the drunk from being able to turn the key on a car. And those aren't the real pictures of God, and they're not the real pictures of the world. Now, having said that, God cries at the death of Lazarus. God cries because of the pain and the anguish in this world, and it's not the way he designed the world, and it's not what he expects in this world, but he tells us, his people, to go out there and fight these things. We are not just to pray, but to live, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And we're to, these injustices, rather than make us say there is no God, should make us rise up and say, on behalf of God, we're appalled, and we're going to do everything in our power to make this the way God would like it to be, which is our responsibility in this fallen world. So these views, these emotional points should not drive people away from belief. They should help people understand how critical it is that we do believe.
And again, just well said. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Mark Lanier. And I might just mention that you might think about, in your mind's eye, scales of justice, or you might even think about putting something, if you want to take some notes, on the left-hand side and the right-hand side. And we're going to look at some of the evidence to be considered, which is a significant part of the book. But I also love, Mark, the fact that you were even talking about reading Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion. You kept expecting for a really good argument. And as I was reading that part of your book, it reminded me of Alvin Plantinga, who's been on this program with us before, who said, you might say that some of the forays that Richard Dawkins engages in to philosophy are sophomoric, but that would be unfair to sophomores, which is kind of his punchline. And you sort of said something similar to this in your book. So when we come back from the break, we're going to spend some time looking at some of the evidence to be considered. Can there be an objective basis for right and wrong? What about justice? What about human dignity? Of course, what about this issue of suffering, which we just talked about? What about the various issues of prayer and some of the other things we've talked about? We'll try to cover as many of those as we can, but they're all part of this book, which is coming out soon, published by InterVarsity Press. Mark Lanier has done a great job in his previous book, Christianity on Trial. This one is equal in terms of really giving you some ability to make cases and to begin to engage in a good discussion. So we're putting some tools in your evangelism and apologetics toolbox. And so when we come back, we'll spend some time with him looking at some of those pieces of evidence and weighing those scales. All that coming up right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/signup. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints Commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Privileged to have with us again Mark Lanier as we are talking about the book Atheism on Trial. I might also recommend his previous book, Christianity on Trial, some of his other books. Of course, an individual was the founder of the Lanier Law Firm as well as the Lanier Theological Library, so great resources that are available. And you can pre-order the book, and it will be out shortly. But, Mark, if we can, let's pull out the scale of justice and begin to look at the evidence. Court back in session. And first of all, that issue of objective right and wrong. Very important issue, especially in a court of law, but even in daily life, isn't it?
Oh, there's no question. That's a seminal issue for all of us. We all want to rear our children and teach them to do right and not wrong, and we hope they turn out to do so. We want our neighbors to treat us right. We care immensely about right and wrong in our communities and in our country and in the world. And there's hardly anyone living in the post-Hitler era that doesn't recognize the significance of right and wrong being valued. But the question becomes, where do we get a clear, provable right and wrong? Where do we get a right and wrong that we can say is an adequate reference point for us to live? You've got some choices. Well, if you're an unbeliever, if there is no God, then all this world consists of, all this universe consists of, are these molecules made up of atoms and subatomic particles. You've got these little protons and neutrons and electrons and all sorts of subatomic particles that exist. And from those little atoms, molecules are made, and as the molecules are made, they can conglomerate into larger clumps of stuff, and ultimately, through some process that still defies a lot of imagination with me, out of just pure chance, they've got these human beings walking around on this dirt clod, spinning around a sun and some fringe of this solar system, of this universe, and so here we've got it. Now, did those molecules, those atoms and molecules, can you work from that basis and say, gee, it's wrong to kill someone, or it's wrong to steal, or it's wrong to lie, or it's wrong to... Can you really do that? If all we are is a sack of chemicals and cosmic stardust that somehow started thinking, quote unquote, can we say that we as an animal shouldn't be killing and eating each other, even though we know it's okay for fish to do so? Fish eat fish all the time. Monkeys eat monkeys all the time. But for some reason, there's a reason we humans should not be allowed to do that. Well, you can't get there simply by adding up the molecules and assuming at some point they triggered a morality or an ethic that should apply to everyone. It's either you just say, look, it's totally arbitrary and random, it's just the way we want it to be, or you've got enough intellectual integrity to say, okay, how could there be right and wrong? It's so hardwired into our brain. Where did that come from? And if there's a God out there who himself, or Evans herself, I'm not defining the Christian God in this book per se, but if there is a God out there, a deity out there who is moral and who is ethical, who made us in his image such that we would be hardwired for that, all of a sudden it makes sense why we're that way. But without that, we got nothing. It's just an illusion of morality.
So well said. Well, that sort of brings us to Chapter 7, in which you talk about the fact that, as we just have discussed, if we're just a sack of chemicals, where do you get this idea of dignity? Of course, B.F. Skinner and Richard Dawkins and a variety of other individuals take it to its logical extension, which people don't really like, because if you believe in human rights and you believe that we should have a court system that is based upon the fact that human beings should be treated differently than other other animals and human beings have dignity and value and rights, you have a difficulty, again, if you're an atheist, don't you?
Yeah, you absolutely do. There's a law professor, philosopher, who's really a top-flight thinker named Thomas Nagel. He's up
yes.
at NYU.
Mm-hmm.
And I applaud him for being a little bit more intellectually honest on this than a lot of other people, because he's basically willing to say there is no basis for human dignity, and yet we know there is a basis for human dignity. And it's a struggle to find out why it's there. And our son took his PhD, or actually it's called a DPhil over there, from Oxford University in philosophy and logic. And he had, when he was over there, of course, and still today, a lot of friends who were really pursuing these great studies on a doctorate level at Oxford. And I would talk to them, and some of his friends were not believers. And I would say to them, why do you believe there is human dignity? How do you justify that if all we are is a sack of chemicals? And the response was generally one that I consider a cop-out. It boils down to this. Well, I can't explain it. I can't say where it comes from. I just know it's true, kind of like mathematics. I can't explain where mathematics come from. They just are. It just 2 plus 2 just is 4. And in the same way, human dignity is real. And I said, that's just a real cop-out.
Yes.
I said, that's saying that I've got no intellectual basis for believing it, for defending it, or for challenging someone who has a different view of human dignity. But I said, as a practical matter, let's get real. If all we are sacks of chemicals, then why on earth, as a caring person, when your grandmother died, did you incinerate her body instead of feed her to pigs or to others who could use the protein and make more food stuff for all the starving people in the world? He said, well, I wouldn't burn Granny. And I said, I wouldn't feed Granny to people. And I said, why? If all she is a sack of chemicals, why don't you reuse those chemicals for the greater good of those still alive? I said, because somewhere you have a dignity that you've attached to her that's so deep-seated and deep-rooted within you that you will say it's true even though you've got no basis for believing that. None.
Yes. And again, one of the things I love about your book is, let's face it, there are a lot of people that may have heard some of these arguments, but they've never read Richard Dawkins. They've never read Thomas Nagel. But those ideas find their way into Twitter posts and Facebook of pages and common arguments and those kinds of things. And so you really take a good amount of time trying to help people understand where some of these ideas come from and then pointing out some of the difficulties. But I thought we might then come to the questions that people sometimes have, and they say, okay, Mark Lanier, you're a real smart guy. What about the arguments against God? So far, you've been giving me arguments for God, and the two that you bring up most significantly in different chapters are the problem of suffering and then the invisible God. I don't see God. Now, we're not going to try to solve all the theological issues related to evil and suffering, but in about 2 minutes, can you give us at least a way to begin to respond to those questions that come up so often?
Yeah, I urge your listeners to consider the practical implications. And a lot of people don't like this argument that I make, but I make it anyway. People say, okay, if there's a God, why doesn't that God cure cancer tonight at 6 o'clock? 6 o'clock, all cancer's wiped out. Now, there will, this idea has no legs. If God cured cancer at 6 o'clock, we've got an immediate problem with all of the hospitals and all of the investments and all of the money and people whose careers are built into that. That's fine. They'll just go unemployed and have to find another job. But when they go unemployed, you start following the repercussions of this. And the bottom line is the world can't exist as the world exists now if God just eliminates suffering. What it's going to take, I as a Christian believe God will do that one day. God will come back, but it will not be this world as it is today. Because to eliminate suffering, you've got to radically eliminate this entire world. That's the Christian view of what God will do. It's just like your checkbook. He doesn't balance it at the end of each day. It will be balanced, however, at the right time. So take these arguments, take them to their logical conclusion, And even the argument of suffering is one where, if you take it to its logical conclusion, it actually provides the basis for Christian thought and belief. It doesn't invalidate it at all.
That's very good. Let's take a break. When we come back, of course, we'll get into just a couple other short issues. But most importantly, I want to equip, Mark, if we can, some of the people that will get your book, either on Kindle or paperback, and then how they can use that. And again, you've been teaching so much of this in your Sunday school class there at Champion Forest Baptist Church. And I think we can get some ideas about how to put some shoe leather to these ideas and make them effective. Or, changing the metaphor, maybe put some more tools in our evangelistic and apologetics toolbox. We'll be back right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes as we continue our conversation about Atheism on Trial, published by InterVarsity Press, written by Mark Lanier. A lawyer examines the case for unbelief. And I thought for just a minute, before we get to your closing arguments, we might at least address the issue of science and faith. Because, Mark, you know as well as I do, some people have a scientific background and others don't. But even if they don't, they say, well, I believe in science, so that's really excludes God. And I think you sort of already answered the question, because when we try to say, do we have scientific evidence for God, that's like trying to, again, use a thermometer to measure the distance between you and me, and it's not even the right kind of measurement. But how do we answer the question that sometimes people have about, well, I believe in science, so that excludes the possibility that God actually exists?
Well, I believe in science and I believe in God. Those two are not mutually exclusive. God is who gives us a basis for believing in science. God, as revealed in Scripture, as he has revealed himself, is a cause and effect God. You sin, you die. I mean, it's cause and effect. And he has set this world up to be a cause and effect world. And so when we see this world, we see a world that makes sense. It's not a Harry Potter world of magic and spells. It's a world of consistent science that works. And I think that from the scriptural perspective, science is a tool that God has given us to deal with the tragic consequences of the fall. And so in science, we're able to find ways to help alleviate disease. We'll find ways to help increase the food supply for people. Science can be used for a lot of good. Now, the problem is, like everything else, you can take something meant for good and use it for bad. So the same science that can give us an MRI to help us find a tumor in time to treat it is the same science that can produce an atom bomb that can destroy people indiscriminately. And so like everything else, science can be used good or bad. But science and faith are not opposite ends of a teeter-totter. In antiquity, some Christian writers would talk about the two different books of God. There's the book of the Bible and the book of nature. But those two books don't contradict each other. And our problem is we sometimes get beguiled into reading the early Genesis story, for example, as if it's a science textbook dictating to us today certain truths. And what we don't understand is we're taking it out of context. And what God was concerned with Moses on Sinai was not fixing Israel's science. He was concerned with fixing their theology. Now, in the process, he's not saying things that are scientifically invalid. But if we read the Bible and it talks about the sun rising and the sun setting and the sun traversing across the sky, that does not mean that the earth is flat and still and the sun rotates around the earth. That means it's an expression in the age and era of the fact that from the beginning of the day to the end of the day. You know, and so we've got to read the Bible in context. I just don't think people should ever be hung up on the conflict of science and faith. They need to see those two married together because they properly are.
And we did an interview a while back, of course, on the return of the God hypothesis. In fact, we even produced a little booklet here on God and Science that you can read as well. But, Counselor, I guess it's time for your closing argument, and that's one of your last chapters because it provides an opportunity to once again touch on some of the issues that we talked about with you years ago in your book, Christianity on Trial, because many places, Mark, are where you have learned these, and I want to pass these very helpful ideas and tools on to our listeners because you've had a chance over these many years to use them to know what works and to know what might be convincing to individuals that are honestly skeptical, but at least open to evidence. And that's why you present this particular case in this book, Atheism on Trial, because if people are open to evidence, the evidence is pretty clear, isn't it?
I think it is, and that's my big plea in my closing argument, whether I'm trying, I just finished trying the opioid case in Ohio, the national opioid case, and I gave a closing argument knowing that all of the media were watching, knowing that it had national repercussions, and I got in there, and my argument in that is no different than my argument here. It's simple. It's look at the evidence. Look at the evidence and make a common sense assessment. And the evidence is not simply something that you're thinking about on a chalkboard. The evidence includes look at the world around us and why it is the way it is, and consider the possible reasons. We're cosmic stardust, or there's a God. Consider those reasons and work through it. But don't just look at the world around us. Look at us each individually. Be subjective. Look inside yourself. Why is it that you cry out for meaning in life? I mean, do you think, honestly, cosmic stardust and chemicals cries out for meaning? Why is it that you will quickly say something's not fair? Kids learn that at the earliest age. That's not fair. And adults still decry the same thing. That's not just. That's not fair. How could there be a God? There's too much unfairness. Well, I mean, the very fact that we care about fairness internally, what does that tell us but that we were hardwired for that? Otherwise, we just sit here and say, hey, life is hard, and then you die. Who cares about fairness? And so, so within the framework of that, you sit here and you look at the evidence and you make that final assessment. What is the reasonable explanation for why the world is the way it is, why I am the way I am, and how can I live within that worldview consistently, not being a hypocrite? And I think all of the evidence weighs so heavily in favor of the God view instead of the godless view that, frankly, I don't, to coin the old phrase, re-up the old phrase, I don't have enough faith not to believe in God.
That's right. And again, you have competing views of reality, and you've got some great diagrams all the way through the book. A worldview where there is no God, and it fails the correspondence test, really, because your view of the world does not correspond at all with reality when you get into all sorts of different issues that we've already talked about, like objective right and wrong and nobility and significance, and then the other worldview with a biblical God. So, again, the book's coming out shortly. It is entitled Atheism on Trial. It is published by InterVarsity Press. You can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so you can get it ahead of time, paperback or Kindle. And you also can find out more about Mark Lanier, and enjoyed the conversation in the past on Christianity on Trial. And I certainly enjoyed our conversation today on Atheism on Trial. And so thank you for writing the books, and thank you as a busy lawyer for giving us an hour today here on Point of View.
Such a joy to be on your show. You keep doing the work you're doing, Kirby. You make the world a better place.
Well, thank you so very much. Let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to get into some issues in the news. While we're talking about human rights, I might just mention that we do indeed have an opportunity for you to speak out on this issue of human rights, because we are coming close to the Winter Olympics. So we have a fact sheet here in which we're saying, look, United States is not going to boycott the Olympics. The International Olympic Committee is not going to. The American athletes are not. But it doesn't mean that you can't boycott it. You don't have to watch it. And so we wanted to give you some of the facts and let you make a decision about that. And I might just mention that I'm starting to see all sorts of other areas where people are talking about this as well. We'll get into that in the next hour. Of course, the president had some things to say about election laws and a variety of other things. So we have a lot to cover in this next hour. But again, if you want to join us, you can give us a call, 1-800-351-1212. And again, if you'd like to know more about the book Atheism on Trial, it is on the website. And you might even want to listen to it again or pass it on to others. Simply go to that red button that says watch or listen and pass it on to others. We'll take a break. We'll come back with more right here on Point of View.
Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas recently said, "The Declaration of Independence has weathered every storm for 245 years. It birthed a great nation. It abolished the sin of slavery, and it endeavored to address its effects. While we have failed the Declaration time and again, and the ideals of the Declaration time and again, I know of no time," said Thomas, "when the ideals have failed us." While some see our founding as fatally flawed and promote ideas that have failed every time they've been tried, at Point of View, like Justice Thomas, we still believe in America's ideals. And if you do too, make a difference today. Join the Truth Team as we promote the unchanging truth that gave us liberty and prosperity. Visit pointofview.net/team or call 1-800-347-5151. The original Americans responded to the call. Will you? Pointofview.net/team and 1-800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kirby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kirby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kirby Anderson.
This hour, we're going to spend some time talking about a variety of issues in the news, but of course one that everybody seems to be talking about was the decision by the president to go to Atlanta and do what he could to completely criticize the attempt to make a little bit more restrictive, but maybe a little more organized voting laws. And these have to do with these voter integrity laws that have been passed and, of course, have resulted in him requiring the attorney general to sue both Georgia and Texas over some of these laws. As we document in this booklet that we've made available in the past on voter fraud exists. There are ways to address the issue. One of those is certainly to have voter ID. And for those people that somehow want to argue that that is restrictive and that what was requested in Georgia or in Texas, but we'll just focus on Georgia since that's where he was going to prevent people from actually voting and would be actually voter suppression, you have a couple of problems with that. Problem number one is, if you just look at Georgia, after the voter ID requirement was instituted, the percentage of people who voted in the next election did not go down, it went up. If you also want to say that indeed requesting a photo ID is somehow repressive or it is restricting individuals from being able to vote, explain how we now have, the best count I can come up with, 35 different states that do require a photo ID for an individual to vote. So that is, of course, one of the issues that is raised. Another one is that there was a limit in the number of days for early voting. Then Georgia, again, I'll use Georgia as the example, 17 days. Well, if indeed that is restrictive, then explain to any fair-minded individual why, when you look at other states run by Democrats, for example, New York and New Jersey, they only have early voting for 10 days. Matter of fact, in the past, it used to be 9 days. And so if indeed Georgia is restricting voting because it only, quote, has 17 days for early voting, what about states like New York and New Jersey that have 10 days? I have a better idea. The former senator from Delaware is the current president. That would be Joe Biden. What is the early voting for Delaware? It didn't used to exist, but now you have a 10-day early voting, which again is lower than Georgia. I know my problem with this, and it's the one that sometimes Lathan Watts or Merrill Matthews points out. I'm using logic. And of course, logic had nothing to do with what the president was saying yesterday. But for those of you that heard it and said, now maybe there's something a little bit wrong, because after all, the president went to Atlanta to deliver this particular screed against the election laws that have been implemented, and actually then said that now the United States Senate has no option but to change the filibuster laws so that it can begin to pass two particular pieces of legislation that would completely invalidate some of these arguments. When you have individuals that are standing up there like the president making a claim that this is sort of like George Wallace or Bull Connor. Matter of fact, when he said Bull Connor, I was kind of looking, very few people clapped because I think they thought, is that like an NFL athlete or something like that? I probably didn't even know enough history to know what that was. But again, if you want to be on the side of Dr. Martin Luther King or George Wallace, this is a moment to decide to defend our elections, defend our democracy. You recognize that there's a fair amount of hyperbole in this, coming from a man who warned some of his African-American voters years ago when he was the vice president that if you elect the Republicans, they're going to put you back in chains. I don't think at the time he seriously believed that Republicans would literally get out shackles and chains and put them on you. So some of that could be rhetorical flourish, but the intensity by which he expressed that, you begin to wonder if possibly he really believes it, given his current mental state. But again, in case you wonder, to try to provide a little bit of logic to this conversation, we have a provision, for example, in Georgia, which again he criticized, that would require voters, if they wanted to get a mail-in ballot, they had to provide a driver's license or a state ID number, which I think is much better and superior to the one where they were to sign their name, and then you were supposed to see whether or not that signature matched. There's too much subjectivity here. You can figure out what your driver's license number is, or you can figure out what your state ID number is, and that seems really like a good idea. But again, if you're convinced that Georgia is sort of the outlier, this is exactly, to almost the letter, the same thing which is required in states like Maryland and Pennsylvania and others. The argument that is made in the law, for example, saying that election officials are to wait till the polls close before they start counting votes, is exactly what is required in the state of New York, and again, the state that former Senator, now President Joe Biden represented in Delaware. I can give you example after example after example of how they were trying to make it sound yesterday like the laws in Georgia are somehow very different or so extreme or so restrictive, and yet they parallel so many other things that we find in other states, oftentimes states that are completely controlled by the Democratic Party. But there's another issue to that as well, and that is the argument being made right now is that we need to get rid of the filibuster. Now, we're going to have an action item on that, so I'll certainly give you the short version of this. But the argument is that we should no longer have the filibuster, at least for something as vital as our national elections. Well, we have a 50-50 Senate, so even if you got rid of the filibuster and you no longer had to come up with 60 votes, you only had to come up with 50 votes, you've got a problem here, because when you look at this issue of the filibuster, first of all, there are a lot of people that, even on the Democratic side, don't want to go along. For example, that would be Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia. That would be Senator Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona. But they're not the only ones, because the other day somebody pointed out that there's a Democratic senator from Arizona who also doesn't go along with changing the filibuster, and it's not Kyrsten Sinema, it's Mark Kelly. And then if you want to go a little bit to the north, to Montana, Senator John Tester, also a Democrat, has said taking the filibuster off the table is not an idea he's too crazy about either. So it's really questionable whether or not right now Chuck Schumer, who is the Senate Majority Leader, has even 46 votes to remove the filibuster. And so this could be just a lot of rhetorical flourish. But if nothing else, I want to come back after the break to talk about what it might mean if we were to do that. And then we'll move on to some other issues, because there are a lot of other topics. But since this has been kind of the big one that not only has resulted in the original speech by the president, Joe Biden, but also some of the reaction that has come from a number of individuals, including the Senate Minority Leader, we're going to come back and get into that in a little more detail. And then we're going to cover a couple of other very important issues, not the least of which is, are we ever going to get some of these kids back to school, for example, in Chicago and other states? So we've got a lot of topics to put on the table. Each one, if that raises a question in your mind, feel free to give us a call. 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kirby Anderson.
Americans are being watched digitally, and it doesn't seem to matter whether they're innocent citizens, suspects, or criminals. That is the argument made in the brief filed by the Rutherford Institute in a case before the Supreme Court. The case involves a man who federal investigators traced using cell site location information that allowed them to trace his movements back in time. He was arrested, indicted, and convicted. The issue isn't his guilt, but the fact that the information was gathered electronically without a warrant. The use of this technology provided a conviction, but it can also be used to identify where you are at a given time. It can tell if you're at home, in church, at a store, or on a political event. The typical response for many people is they have nothing to hide. But consider how this technology is currently being used in communist China. John Whitehead is the president of the Rutherford Institute and observes that cell phones have become de facto snitches, offering up a steady stream of digital location on users' movements and travels. Then also consider the fact that the police are tracking people's movements by way of license plate toll readers, scouring social media posts, triangulating data from cell phone towers and Wi-Fi signals, layering facial recognition software on top of that, and then cross-referencing footage from public social media posts. Essentially, Americans are being swept up in a massive digital data dragnet that does not distinguish between those who are innocent of wrongdoing, suspects, and criminals. We are supposedly protected by the Fourth Amendment, but this new technology allows investigators access to our lives and activities. We are not only losing our privacy, but technology is being used against us even when we are innocent of wrongdoing. That is why I'm glad this case is before the Supreme Court. I'm Kirby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
Go deeper on topics like you just heard by visiting pointofview.net. That's pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Once again, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212. And we'll continue our conversation for just a few minutes on this issue of election. Then when I get to the Winter Olympics, because that has been our action item. And I've been struck by the fact that not only are we raising this question about whether or not we should be watching what's on television during the Winter Olympics, some others have been as well. First of all, again, when we come to the issue of the filibuster, this is a filibuster that has been in effect for more than a century, essentially 2 centuries, but we have kind of a modified filibuster now, and that's why you've had some people say, well, if we had a real filibuster where somebody talks for a period of time, that would be the case. But the bottom line is you need 60 votes. And you don't have 50 votes. And so it's pretty much a lot of rhetorical flourish, but the reality isn't very good, because we know for a fact that 2 very vocal opponents of removing the filibuster would be Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Now, there was a time not so long ago when you had a very significant, I think it was about almost 36 Democrats saying that they did not want to remove the filibuster, back when, of course, you had a president by the name of Donald Trump, because then all of a sudden they recognized that that would allow Republicans to push through some things. But now when the shoe's on the other foot, there's still, interestingly enough, quite a bit of concern on the part not only of Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, but I have in front of me here 2 other comments, one from Mark Kelly, He's going to be running for election, so that's going to be important in Arizona, and has not committed to being willing to change the Senate rules on the filibuster. And if he's not committed by now, you got to wonder whether he would be committed later on. And then John Tester says that talking filibuster might be something he could support. You know, there was a real filibuster, but not the removing this for the exception of voting rights. If you want to go a little bit deeper, Jean Shaheen, who is a Democrat from New Hampshire, said reform is needed, but it was really promoting modest change. So you start adding those three individuals to others. I don't know that you have 45 votes in the United States Senate for getting rid of the filibuster, but I think it will be an action item that we will talk about in the future, and we will post. Just before we get to some action items we're going to be talking about here today, and we'll take some phone calls too, I also thought it was kind of interesting that a couple of people like Byron York of the Washington Examiner pointed out that, quote, as Joe Biden had arranged to promote his demand that Congress make this Democratic agenda on elections, it was striking how few of the people you would have thought would be standing next to him would actually be there. Byron York puts it this way: this is not a warm welcome. Just look at the New York Times headline: voting rights groups skipping Biden's speech in Georgia over inaction. Stacey Abrams, the Democratic candidate for governor, also will not be there. She cited a scheduling conflict. A scheduling conflict. Oh, think this through. Now, you have the President of the United States, you have the Vice President of the United States, and Stacey Abrams, who is running in the same party of those two individuals, could not make room in her schedule for them. I think that tells you a great deal about how far this might get. But you wouldn't know that by watching the mainstream press, and that's why I thought I would bring a little bit of that to the conversation today. Let's go to the phones, though, and give some of you a chance to weigh in with your comments. And since we've been talking about Georgia, let's first go to Georgia on the Good News Network. Brick, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View. Brick, do we have you there? You are on the air. But maybe I need to put him on hold and see if he's ready to talk to us in just a minute. And we'll get back to him in a minute because I do want to hear some of his comments. But let's, if we can, again, get to one other issue there, and that is the attempt to address these issues have been met with a little bit of opposition. And I thought I'd just give you a quick quote here from the Senate Minority Leader, that's Mitch McConnell. And he said that the political left keeps pitching the big lie that mainstream state voting laws are somehow Jim Crow 2.0. If the governor who signs the bill happens to be a Republican, then McConnell said, in one of those states that triggered this meltdown, the new proposals mandated more days of early voting than many Democratic-run states provide. Our democracy is not in crisis. Repeating this rhetoric does not make it factual. The 2020 election saw the highest turnout in more than 100 years. You do have to remember the fact that we are talking about an incredible amount of turnout, and yet at the same time, the argument has been that these kinds of laws are restrictive, but the evidence goes the other direction. And so again, Chuck Schumer has been going along with it for so long, in which he said, for example, the ideologues in the Senate want to turn what the Founding Fathers called the cooling saucer of democracy into the rubber stamp of dictatorship. And he said that back in 2005, but now today he's trying as hard as he can possibly move to try to remove that and to remove the filibuster. I think we have him back now. We'll go to Georgia. Good News Network. Brick, thank you for joining us today.
Good afternoon, Kirby. I'd just like to make a comment about the president's trip to Georgia. I understand that he came to Atlanta to speak at the Atlanta University yesterday. He has made probably several trips. He and the vice president, and they stay in Atlanta. What I don't understand is, what is Joe Biden? I use the word hiding. Why can he not travel all over the state of Georgia? Why has he got to go in Atlanta instead of visiting the other half a dozen major cities in this state? And to me, that's a question. Joe Biden is trying to hide something, or he cannot face the constituents in the state of Georgia. He's supposed to be the president of everybody all over the state of Georgia, not just a few in Atlanta.
Well, again, most presidents tend to go where they are going to get the most enthusiastic reception. And you can understand why the president right now is being a little tentative, because when he's made his trips into places like Pennsylvania and other places, he's greeted with all sorts of people holding signs that are saying, let's go, the line, and a variety of others. And so, I understand why he wants to go in a place where he's going to get a little more favorable reception. But nevertheless, you're right. It's probably true of all presidents. They're going to go where they're going to get people clapping and crowds cheering him, not where they're going to be jeering him and booing him. So I understand that, but I think you raise a good question, and we'll leave that for what it is. Just before we take a break, though, I thought it would be helpful, since yesterday we did talk about the fact that we do have this fact sheet available to you so that you can decide whether you and your family want to watch the Winter Olympics. And the National Review, and in particular Jim Garrity, said, can we watch these Olympics in good conscience? I did not know this was coming out, but he's making the case for us. So let me just point out that he gives you a variety of quotes that remind you of what is going on right now. For example, this one comes from Reuters. Dutch athletes competing in next month's Beijing Winter Olympics will need to leave their phones and laptops at home in an unprecedented move to avoid Chinese espionage, according to the Dutch newspaper on Tuesday. New York Times, Olympic officials are reluctant to look into whether any Beijing 2022 merchandise might have been made under duress by Uyghurs and activist group charges. Here's one from PBS. A third Chinese city has locked down its residents because of COVID-19 outbreak, raising the number of confined to their homes to about 20 million people. And so you can begin to see that there are people trying to say something about what has taken place. So after the break, I do want to give you a couple of other quotes. Some of these come from the legendary broadcaster Bob Costas, because there are now some people that are trying to do what they can to maybe try to cover over some of these human rights abuses. And so we wanted you to have the facts, and that's why we have this fact sheet. As you probably imagine, pretty soon we're going to be talking about not getting rid of the filibuster and not voting on some of these election laws that we've talked about. But at the moment, we have an opportunity for you to go to the website, pointofview.net, in which we recognize that starting on February 4th will be the Winter Olympics in Beijing. Now, I don't flaw the American athletes for wanting to go and compete in the Olympics, and I'm sure we could have had a possibility of boycotting the Olympics, but we know the backlash that came when Jimmy Carter did that in 1980, and that's not happening. But at the same time, we also say that this is very reminiscent of the Olympic Games that took place in Berlin under Adolf Hitler, and so we may not as a country be boycotting these Winter Olympics, but maybe you want to think about it, and so we wanted to give you a fact sheet so you can make up your mind in that regard. We come back from the break, though, I do want to give you a few quotes of people that are trying to tell us it's okay, and I'm not so sure it is, but we'll give you the facts and let you make that decision. We'll be back right after this.
Having civil conversations about important issues seems to be harder and harder. Various media outlets tell people what they should believe, why they should be outraged, and getting people to actually think, well, it can be difficult. Whether it's the gospel, tax issues, social policy, or just about anything else, you need to have solid information and clear thinking to address the hard issues. You need God's truth applied. And that's what you get in less than 2 minutes with Point of View's Viewpoints Commentary, a daily resource to help you be informed and think through the things we need to be talking about. It is free and will arrive in your inbox each day when you visit pointofview.net/sign-up. Sometimes we know we should say something, but we're silent because we're not quite sure what to say. Viewpoints Commentary can help you break the silence and change the narrative. It can make you a more equipped agent for truth. Get your free subscription to the Viewpoints commentary at pointofview.net/signup. Pointofview.net/signup. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kirby Anderson.
Back for the final half hour of A Point of View. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Going to get to another article in just a minute, and that is COVID students and teachers unions. And I probably won't get to, but I thought I'd mention that we have posted a piece by our friend John Stonestreet. It appeared first in Breakpoint, now in the Stream, on the Bible's accuracy vindicated. We might get to it another day because it could go together with some other things which show the incredible evidence for the historical accuracy of the Bible. This one coming from kind of archaeology as well as geology. It's kind of an interesting argument, and it would take a while to develop, so it is there for you to read, and maybe we'll get to it in the future. Because I went a little bit longer only because today, to my surprise, and a matter of fact, to my delight, if I could be honest, we have this piece that came out by Jim Garrity, Can We Watch These Olympics in Good Conscience? And it actually parallels exactly what we have been focusing on these last 2 days as one of the resources that is available if you go to our website, pointofview.net. We are convinced that, of course, we can't ask the American athletes to stay home. We have done that before, but that's not going to happen, and the president's not going to call for that. The International Olympic Committee is not going to call for that, but we don't have to support what is going to be an opportunity for China to actually have the national and international stage while they have such a terrible record of human rights. And so let me for just a minute quote from Bob Costas. If you've ever watched the Olympics, you know who he is. Of course, if you watch any sports, you know who he is. And he, interestingly enough, actually talked about this a little bit. And so he said, look, as unsatisfying as it may be, the course of action now that the Biden administration is taking is the correct one. Okay, I don't disagree with that, but again, he was pointing out that this full boycott of the Moscow Games by the Carter administration in 1980, well, it did not influence Soviet policy. It did deprive a number of U.S. athletes of an opportunity to compete on the world stage, but I think it really tarnished the image of Russia. So to say that it didn't have any impact, I think would be a bit of a stretch. But okay. Bob Costa went on to say, not much was accomplished in terms of geopolitics, and a lot of athletes were hurt in the process. I think the best outcome here is the U.S. is stepping aside diplomatically, which is very insignificant, but is something rather than nothing, and that's getting a lot of coverage. The best thing that could happen after that is the U.S. to win a whole lot of gold medals, and the Chinese are forced to listen to the Star-Spangled Banner over and over again. Okay. That's his argument. You can accept it or reject it as you wish. But the point that then Jim Garrity makes is, look, having the American athletes staying home isn't going to free one Uyghur Muslim or one Hong Kong democracy activist. It's certainly not going to forestall what I think China wants to do, and that is to engage in a military action against Taiwan. And it's not the American athletes' fault that the International Olympic Committee chose Beijing, which just hosted the Summer Games in 2008, over so many other cities where that could have taken place, which tells you a lot about the International Olympic Committee, that was not an issue. So he goes on, that is Jim Garrity goes on to say the Chinese government and the International Olympic Committee want us to act like everything is normal and that this is just another winter's game taking place in some far-off foreign capital. But nothing about the Chinese government, he says, is normal right now, from the ongoing genocide of the Uyghurs to the crackdown in Hong Kong to the military aggression towards Taiwan to the refusal to cooperate with the World Health Organization on what? How many times we talked about this? The investigation into the origins of COVID-19, as well as the sudden disappearance of various, not to mention doctors, but how about the tennis star Peng Shuai and all sorts of other individuals. So the Chinese government may not be the most brutal, repressive, authoritarian regime in the world, but it's pretty close to the top of the list, I would say. And again, is an issue that should be of concern. And so you've got to wonder how this is going to be covered. And now NBC is going to be covering this, and it's probably reasonable to assume that NBC is probably not going to put much of an emphasis, if even mention, the human rights abuses or the rather significant military aggression of China. And I think it's worth mentioning, and again, Jim Garrity, thank you for pulling this one out, back in 1996, remember when we had the games in Atlanta, Georgia? That's when NBC was covering those Atlanta games, and NBC actually apologized to the Chinese government when Bob Costa brought up the China's human rights record back then during the opening ceremony. So it tells you a little bit about how China has been given a free pass, in large part because it is such a large market. And you can get yourself in a lot of trouble if you work for the NBA and say something about human rights abuses. You could probably lose your job if you're in Hollywood right now and talks about the abuses of human rights. Probably would lose your job if you work for Apple Computer right now and expressed your concern about the human rights abuses because of all the actions that have been taken by various Fortune 500 companies in that regard. So enough said. If you want the fact sheet, it's free of charge. It's available to you. You can just click on the button there, and it gives you some of the facts that we think you should consider. And then you can decide whether or not you want to turn on NBC and watch the Winter Olympics. Let's move on. Our third article today is the one on the issue of the teachers' unions. This comes from Stephen Moore, who's been on the program with us many times before. And he says, it started in Chicago, where there was an incredible 91% of union teachers who voted to go on strike and refused to do what they get paid to do, that is, to teach. Then the union walkout spread to Maryland, New Jersey, and California. And again, to her credit, the Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot, who is a liberal Democrat, actually was very critical of the Chicago teachers unions for, quote, these are her words, holding the kids hostage, unquote. Well, she's right. So we'll give her credit in that regard. Now, Stephen Moore goes on to say that President Joe Biden keeps talking about how much he and his fellow Democrats in Washington care about the children. He has correctly stated that there's no health reason for closing schools, but in this latest episode of Union Choice, you can see that is something where he has not necessarily found his voice. He could go to Atlanta and criticize the voting laws in Atlanta, but so far been a little harder to hear too much being said about the teachers' unions. Anyway, back to Stephen Moore. He says he thinks it's time for what he calls a Ronald Reagan moment. Now, what does he mean by that? He said in his first year of his presidency, Ronald Reagan in 1981 fired thousands of illegally striking air traffic controllers that broke the back of that union and put public safety at risk because they were refusing to show up to work. The airlines continued to operate, and eventually there was a opportunity to really kind of change the direction due to that bold decision. I don't think it's going to happen, but nevertheless, that was his suggestion. And again, pointing out that there is nearly incontrovertible evidence that shows that school closures have no positive effect on the spread of COVID-19. And yet, of course, we have many studies, for example, that have shown keeping kids at home increase the spread of, do not decrease the spread of COVID, but increase all sorts of mental health issues. One of those came from the McKinsey study. We've posted that. I've done a commentary on it as well, in which they talked about the emotional and educational issues related to students. Another student group out of Ohio State University found that districts with fully remote instruction experienced test scores declining up to 3 times greater than districts that had in-person instruction for the majority of the school year. And the biggest issue, which we've talked about on this program and Stephen Moore documents in this third article that you can read in its entirety, is the impact on social justice and income inequality. That is, the group most adversely affected by these online educational attempts were those individuals that were, in most cases, as he describes, poor, of a minority, and below the median academic achievement. Again, as I've said before, some of the top achieving, motivated students with motivated parents, they did okay. but those further down did not do so well. So again, he thinks that there should be a firing of teachers that do not show up on the job, and also makes a very good case, and I would agree with him, that this might be a school choice moment in which you're starting to see all sorts of individuals saying that if indeed teachers aren't going to teach, then maybe we should allow parents to make choices so that they can send their kids to schools where the teachers do want to teach. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Anyway, that's our third article we've posted today. Save the Children, Fire the Teachers Unions is what he calls it, or I call it COVID Students and Teachers Unions. All that on our website. We have more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let me just mention as a program note that tomorrow will be our Millennial Roundtable. It will be a great opportunity to hear from a number of guests, some of which you have not heard in a while, so I think you're really going to enjoy this conversation. Friday, of course, is our weekend edition, and Penna Dexter and Lathan Watts will be with us, and so we'll get into some of these topics and pick up a few more pieces along the way. So a lot to cover, and I hope you will certainly take advantage of the fact that we've posted some great information about this new book coming out by Mark Lanier. You might even get his previous book, Christianity on Trial. So whether it's Atheism on Trial, Christianity on Trial, they should be both books on your bookshelf and will really equip you to make a difference as you talk to other people about the Bible. And, of course, we have our fact sheet here about the 2022 Beijing Winter Olympics. And I was, again, very encouraged to see that even as we started talking about this, there are other people talking about it as well. Just as we wind down here today, I thought you might describe 2021 and now even January of 2022 as the tale of two Joes. What do I mean by that? Joe Manchin and Joe Biden. Charlie Cook put it this way. He said, Senator Manchin was correct about inflation and its intended risks. Senator Manchin's many critics were wrong about inflation and its attended risks. It's amazing how many times when he said something, it turns out to be true, and everybody criticized them, and then it turns out he's true. He's actually accurate as well. He says, interestingly enough, that the United States is fortunate that Senator Manchin has withstood the considerable pressure to acquiesce to a lie and steadfastly held his ground. Where would we be if he did not exist? I'm not sure Kirsten Sinema would stand as strong, but she's willing to because he has, and some of the other senators I mentioned earlier are willing to stand up as well since he's taking the flack. But if you look at this, he has been right, especially just on this issue of inflation, not to mention everything else, voting rights, filibuster, on and on. But again, according to the latest numbers, and we've yet to really talk about this, we might get into some of that on Friday, inflation has plowed ahead of its fastest 12-month pace in nearly 40 years since December, according to a closely watched gauge the Labor Department released Wednesday. The Consumer Price Index, which again I always say is too low, but that's okay, is now increased 7%. So we are dealing with something that is unprecedented for any of you that are, well, first of all, younger than 40 years of age, but even if you were a 10-year-old, you probably didn't pay attention to it. So for anybody less than maybe 50 years of age, you've never experienced what we may now be heading into. Those of us that have been around more than 50 years know what the 1970s looked like. So we'll talk about that. But this is the fastest increase since the early 1980s, of course. So anyway, Charlie Cook talks about the fact that this really has been a year of the tale of two Joes. There's been Joe Biden, whose core position on inflation has been that he wouldn't dare interfere with his presidency. In July, Joe Biden insisted that there's nobody suggesting there's unchecked inflation on the way, no serious economy. That's totally different. By December, he says, well, when inflation can no longer be denied, then Joe Biden alternated between insisting that inflation was about to go away and pretending that his plan to spend another $3.5 trillion would somehow prevent it from getting worse. Today, the White House is sounding equally schizophrenic. Inflation is peaking, according to Jen Psaki, and then, also, but it's not real. And so you get such bizarre comments right now out of the press room there, as well as from the Oval Office. But then Charles Cook goes on to say, but then there's been Joe Manchin, who has not only seen inflation coming, but has clearly articulated the link between its pending arrival and our excessive government spending. You think? In September of last year, Joe Manchin explained that he wasn't thrilled by the prospect of adding trillions more in spending to the World War II-sized figure that the federal government had approved since March of 2020. Given the risk that such spending would pose, suggesting that spending trillions of dollars more would have an impact on inflation, he said, and ignores, he goes on to say, the everyday reality that America's families continue to pay an unavoidable inflation tax. It might not surprise you, but the next booklet we have going out to our donors is on the subject of inflation, of course. Well, then in November, Joe Manchin was even clear. He said, I, for one, vowed, he said, won't support a multi-trillion-dollar bill without greater clarity about why Congress chooses to ignore the serious effects inflation and debt have on our economy and existing government programs. Elected leaders, Joe Manchin said, continue to ignore exploding inflation, that our national debt continues to grow, and interest rates on the debt will start to rapidly increase when the Fed, that would be the Federal Reserve, has to start raising interest rates to try to slow down runaway inflation. So, in that case, Joe Manchin was right. President Joe Biden was wrong. And astonishingly enough, Charles Cook says, his approach is only growing worse. Yesterday, according to Roll Call, This was an interesting statement in which it was calling for a demand for the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better bill. The Biden administration is preparing to ask Congress for substantial funding to address the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic domestically and abroad. Steny Hoyer in the House of Representatives, the Journal recorded, said the president will ask lawmakers to appropriate funding for testing, vaccines, and to make sure schools have resources to keep themselves safe. Of course, the obvious question that Charles Cook says is why? As of today, the federal government, are you ready for these numbers? Get out a pen, write them down, because you need to ask your elected representatives about this. As of today, the federal government has spent, are you ready? $5.6 trillion with a T. $5.6 trillion for COVID relief. $2 trillion of that was passed back in March by a, again, partisan line vote. The Democrats voted for those $2 trillion. There should be plenty of money swirling around for testing and vaccines. And then, of course, the issue of schools, because last spring, you might also remember, Congress distributed $123 billion for K through 12 schools for COVID preparedness. That ends up being nearly $1 million per school. And the answer is we want more. So again, just a reminder that we really have this last year in 2021, and I think so far in January of 2022, the tale of two Joes. And I hope that most of you see that there has been some incredible wisdom from a Democrat from West Virginia, Joe Manchin, compared to a Democrat who used to be a senator from Delaware and now is our current president. And it has been the tale of two Joes indeed. Well, we are out of time for today, but let me just mention a couple of resources. First of all, the fact sheet on the Winter Olympics is something we wanted you to download. In about a day or two, we're going to move on to some other issues. After all, if there is a possibility of a vote on the filibuster on these election issues, probably time to give you some information so that you can contact your elected officials about that. So this will be up there for a short time for you to download. My Viewpoints commentary today about digital surveillance. We did mention it a while back, but it's worth focusing on again, and I think we'll get into some of that on Friday. And of course, as I mentioned, our material about the book by Mark Lanier. Again, the Atheism on Trial book coming out shortly, and I would encourage you to pre-order it, get a copy of the book, get a Kindle, and use it effectively as you witness to other individuals. All of that available at our website at pointofview.net. If you want to go back and listen to the interview I did with Mark Lanier, you can click on that button that says watch or listen, and you can then listen to it again, or maybe pass it on to someone else that might need to hear it and benefit from hearing it. That's all we have for today. I want to thank Andrew for his help as an engineer, Steve for his help as a producer, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow right here on Point of View.
We live in a digital generation. Point of View is reaching this often overly plugged-in generation with truth. You can keep up with us 24 hours a day using your phone, your tablet, your laptop, or your desktop. Search for the Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, where you can keep up with today's issues, learn about current and upcoming guests by liking us on Facebook. Also, follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @PointOfViewRTS. That stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show. Learn, interact, make a difference with Point of View using new media. And here's one way you can make a big difference. Help us increase our reach by spreading the word among your friends. Share a Facebook post. Tag us in a tweet. With enough joining us to plant seeds, we'll see a tremendous harvest. Come on, it only takes a minute. Search for Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook, @PointOfViewRTS on Twitter, and subscribe to the Point of View Radio Talk Show channel on YouTube. Learn, interact, share. The Point of View Radio Talk Show. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.